bits. Oh, boils and ghouls. Alright, enough of that. Those of you that know me probably know that Tales from the Crypt is my favorite TV show of all time. I usually try to make time to watch through the entire series at least once a year. Tales from the Crypt originally aired on HBO, and it was based off of the original EC comics, such as Tales from the Crypt, The Vault of Horror, The Haunt of Fear, and Shock Suspense stories. I think there might have been a few others, but I can't recall right now off the top of my head. I think Two-Fisted Tales might have been one. I don't know though. Anyway. And since it was on HBO, you could probably assume that they let it all hang out. There was tons of swearing, violence, nudity. They also had a bunch of big name actors and actresses, not only in the episodes themselves, but people directing, such as Arnold Schwarzenegger, Michael J. Fox, and so on and so forth. And of course, who could forget the famous theme song that was composed by Danny Elfman? Unfortunately, I can't really show too many clips or play too much music because it'll get flagged. But it is what it is. So you're probably wondering, what is this? Because my channel is primarily retro gaming, but I do have a massive love for horror, thriller, suspense, sci-fi, action movies, and stuff like that. But obviously TV shows as well, with Tales from the Crypt being my favorite. But I also enjoy shows like The Twilight Zone, The Outer Limits, Tales from the Dark Side, so on and so forth. But Tales from the Crypt means so much to me that I felt like I wanted to cover every single episode and do a review for it. I know it's a tall task, and some of you might not be interested in watching this content, and if you're not, I do apologize, but this is a bit of a passion project for me. So without any further rambling, let's get started. So Season 1 of Tales from the Crypt is the shortest of all 7 seasons, and it's only 6 episodes. The good thing was, I feel like it was a good mix of episodes to kind of get your palate wet and set the stage for what was to come later. Now before I get into the actual breakdown of the first episode, I wanted to talk a little bit about the Crypt Keeper and John Cassier's role as the Crypt Keeper. Crypt Keeper himself, in the show, is a puppet, very, very nicely done puppet, and the voice is done by John Cassier. I would say in Season 1, the Crypt Keeper is definitely a little bit more subdued, and definitely a little bit more dark in nature. As the series progresses, the Crypt Keeper puns go up and up and up, and honestly, Cassier completely nailed the role. It is so iconic. I got his autograph upstairs from a gift from my wife a few years ago. It's just, the episodes themselves are so good, but so are the intros and the outros of every episode. And Cassier clearly, was steering the boat, so to speak, and he really just kills it. And I always recommend, don't not pay attention, okay, during the intros and the outros of the episodes, because they're so fucking funny. Alright, so now we're going to talk about Episode 1 from Season 1 of Tales from the Crypt. Episode 1 was called The Man Who Was Death, and it aired on June 10th of 1989, and funny enough, it was actually a double header. The second episode of the series also aired the same night, which I hope to cover hopefully this same month. The episode was directed by Walter Hill and also starred J.W. Smith, Roy Brocksmith, and most importantly, William Sadler, who is probably most famously known for his role as Death in Bill and Ted. And oddly enough, he actually makes a cameo later on in the Tales from the Crypt series as Death in an intro and an outro to an episode, which I thought was pretty noteworthy. On top of that, Sadler is also one of the lead actors in the movie that came out in the mid-90s, Tales from the Crypt Demon Knight. Obviously, there was the original Tales from the Crypt movie from way back in the day, as well as Vault of Horror, but this was the first Tales from the Crypt movie, and I guess I don't know what you want to dub it, the 90s reboot of the movies. So in this episode, William Sadler plays a executioner, by way of the electric chair, named Niles Talbot. And funny enough, I just learned this tonight as I was coming up with my script for this. He originally auditioned to be the lead detective in this episode and not Niles Talbot. I guess the Tales from the Crypt crew was actually eyeing up actors like Christopher Walken and John Malkovich to play that role, but I guess Sadler really wanted it, and in a way he just sort of convinced the brass for Tales from the Crypt, and they were like, okay, as long as you just kind of do what you did in your original audition, you're good to go and you'll get the role. So I thought that was pretty funny. This episode definitely would have been very different had he been a secondary role, because the lead detective, obviously he's an important character in the episode. He's not really a lead character, so to speak. Would have been really weird to see Christopher Walken, but yeah, that ended up not happening, so whatever. So these reviews are going to be very spoiler heavy, which kind of goes against my usual nature when it comes to reviewing video games, but I'm kind of recapping the episode. So if you don't want to be spoiled, I guess don't watch any of these. With that being said, I'm gonna get started now. The episode starts out on death row with inmate Charlie Ledbetter being led to the electric chair. And this is kind of where we start seeing the brilliance of the show in general, but also this episode. William Sadler does a great job of breaking down the fourth wall, as well as narrating, and then obviously acting within the scenes. Throughout this opening scene, you kind of get a grasp on the character of Niles Talbot, who really loves his job, and he loves inflicting pain on, inmates and people that were found guilty. Unfortunately for Mr. Talbot, shortly after putting Ledbetter to death, while actually in a diner eating a cheese sandwich, which I always thought was a funny little tidbit that I always remembered, the state gets rid of the death penalty. Yes, so they get rid of capital punishment, and unfortunately he then loses his job. The brass at the jail thinks it's not a good idea for him to retain any job there because the inmates all know who he was and what he did. And Talbot sees it obviously as a slap in the face. He used to watch over the generators as his old job, and obviously he trained somebody as he transitioned into being the executioner, and that person gets to keep his old job, and Talbot unfortunately is now jobless and feeling very betrayed and slapped in the face by his former employers. Shortly thereafter, we kind of cut to a bar scene where the bartender, played by Roy Brocksmith, who is probably most famous for his role in Total Recall. He's also in a Bill and Ted movie. I think it was in The Bogus Adventure. And he's actually also in other Tales from the Crypt episodes, which is pretty funny. You'll see that a lot actually throughout the series. There's going to be a few actors that make multiple appearances, and I'm always like, oh shit, there he is, you know what I mean, something like that. It's always fun to look out for. But essentially news starts going around of criminals that have done clearly some heinous acts getting off for one reason or another, and this does not sit well with Mr. Talbot. He then decides to start taking the law into his own hands. It's almost kind of like between his narrations and obviously his actions, it's kind of like some weird mix of like Taxi Driver, something like Death Wish, some kind of just off the rails vigilante. He's got a crazy mindset, and he's got the wherewithal to back everything up. And I kind of touched on this earlier, but I do want to talk about it again. This episode is very narrative heavy, and like I said, breaking the fourth wall. I think it's pretty cool because it really kind of nails that comic book feel, and it's like present throughout the entire episode. Even though I kind of touched on it before, I felt like it was very purposeful to mention it once again. So now we begin Niles' vigilante streak. His sights are set first on a biker who was actually found guilty of murder, but got off on a clerical error. There was something wrong wording in the arrest warrant or something like that, and this would be Niles' first victim. He goes off in a little narrative before killing said victim about how he, respects bikers, so on and so forth, but ultimately the biker meets his death by way of a bunch of jolts and volts through a fence. An interesting kickoff. Niles Talbot then sets his sight on Theodore Karn and Cynthia Baldwin, who were found not guilty of murder, which this one is definitely my favorite of the episode. So Niles informs us that Theodore was obviously cheating on his wife with Cynthia, and his wife was basically had like a big, I'm assuming, life insurance / inheritance thing going on. So they organized the murder together to kind of, be rich and be able to go off with his mistress. Now, what makes this particular vigilante kill funny and great in my eyes is the way that it's carried out. After they get off, they're celebrating in a hot tub. Niles finds them, and then obviously throws in some electricity to, juice them, so to speak. But the way they die is so freaking funny. I'm hopeful that I can find a good picture to show you guys here. It's just so over the top, the way that they're electrocuted and the faces that they make. It's definitely like one of the high points of the episode for me. After the couple, we get the final execution attempt, which is it's a failed one. A failed execution attempt on a electrical rig on a kind of cage on a stripper / hooker. And as Niles Talbot goes to throw the switch, he finds that it's not working. Obviously he's not able to kill said stripper, and then the authorities find him. And of course, in classic Tales from the Crypt, and I guess in general anthology sort of fashion, the twist happens. As Niles is arrested and put into jail, it is found out very quickly that capital punishment is now back in the state. So that means Niles is now on death row. The episode ends with a really funny reversal of roles, much like the beginning of the episode with Mr. Ledbetter. Mr. Talbot is now the one that is basically shitting his pants, pleading for his life, saying the governor is gonna call, you got this wrong, you all know me, so on and so forth. Unfortunately for him, his pleas go unanswered. He is then strapped into the electric chair, about to meet his maker. And then, as Niles Talbot is strapped into the electric chair, he's given one last chance for final words, where he utters the following: "If a man ain't good at his job, then what the hell is he good for?" Shortly thereafter, he receives the juice and dies, but we're treated to one more, post-mortem narrative. And essentially his final words are, "Don't worry, the governor is gonna call." Overall, I think this episode was a wonderful first entry for the series. I think they kind of hit on all the points as far as HBO goes. You got your language, you got your adult situations, you got your nudity, and you got your funny and interesting violence. It's kind of like the total package. The episode, as I mentioned, also has a very good narrative throughout, interesting camera angles. I like the colors a lot, especially in the outdoor scenes. Really kind of nails that comic book feel, as I mentioned, as well as, kind of adapting it to TV. For me, as far as the Tales from the Crypt landscape of things, William Sadler's role as Niles Talbot is very memorable. I'm sure maybe if it wasn't the first episode, it probably wouldn't be as memorable, but I feel like it was a very good actor choice, despite everything that was leading up to that. I think they made out with the correct actor there. I think Sadler does a really good job of making the role and the episode very memorable with his narration and his overall acting. Alright, rating time. I give The Man Who Was Death a 7.5 out of 10. I wouldn't say this one's in my top 10 episodes or anything, but it's definitely a very good episode. And like I touched on, I think it's a very good beginning episode to the series, and kind of helped set it off on the right foot. Now the second episode, that's a different story. And hopefully you guys enjoyed this video, and if you did, please make sure to like, comment, subscribe if you haven't already, and stay tuned as we continue on with our overview, recap, and review of the Tales from the Crypt HBO series. Take care.